Thank you for turning into our second in the series of Lectionary for Life. Those of you that clicked on the web page last month and found our first series on the September readings, I want to thank you, and I hope the information was helpful. My name is Barbara Moore, and I'm on the faculty here at the Divinity School. We changed our venue this time, moved from a classroom to one of our smaller seminar rooms called the Crozier Room. I think by the time this series is over, we'll have you see the whole Divinity School. We're here to share reflections on the October readings from the Common Lectionary, and then preach a sermon on one of the weekends, and I've chosen the second weekend in October 12th. You know as well as I that none of these events happen in a vacuum, and I want to thank the Department of Institutional Life for their help, and particularly my friend Todd Overfield. Todd is the man behind the camera. And so together, let's begin sharing an overview of the October Revised Commentary readings, lectionary readings. Matthew's Gospel continues to be the focus since we're still in Cycle A. The selections from Matthew's Gospel flow from chapter 21 through 22, and our readings from the Hebrew Scriptures come from the book of Isaiah for 3 weeks. And the epistles come from Philippians and 1 Thessalonians. If you remember last month, we also dealt with Paul's letter to the Philippians. Both of these letters, Philippians and 1 Thessalonians, are original Pauline letters. First, for a few moments, to the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament texts. Early in the month, Isaiah, the 5th chapter, is speaking to Jerusalem, the house of Israel and Judah, and uses the metaphor of a vineyard that was planted and cared for, but a vineyard that was yielding wild grapes. You know, residents of this part of New York State understand this metaphor of vineyards and grapes. And in this reading, God points to destruction and future suffering that the people will face. This text from Isaiah is located in the pre-exile period. Yet the opening lines reveal a very deep, deep affection, the affection God has for the people. And we hear the words, "Let me sing for my beloved." Closeness on God's part, however, is met with unfaithfulness on the people's part. And then as the month unfolds, we turn to the 25th chapter of Isaiah, to a message of hope and promise. Now the people are in exile, and the prophet says to them, "I will wipe away the tears from all faces." Jerusalem, as in the previous reading, is a focal point, but this time with the promise of the removal of disgrace and shame. In chapter 45, while still in exile, the Lord God points to a very unlikely liberator, Cyrus. The Persian leader is used by God to free the people. And so we sense in these 3 readings pain and struggle that a people faced, and the ways in which God was working in their lives in the most unexpected ways. While we often tend to focus on the gospel in our preaching, I think these 3 readings from the prophet Isaiah remind us of modern exiles and refugees, as well as modern vineyards and homes that are often destroyed, and the desperate need so many face around the world because of violence and the need for great hope. The 4th reading from the Hebrew Scriptures is from the book of Leviticus. It's not what you might say one of the more popular books on many levels, But the instructions here for this last Sunday of October are powerful. God is instructing the people through Moses, and God is speaking about the ethical lives that the people are called to live. Listen to this line. You shall love your neighbor as yourselves. Instructions for exiles, refugees, those of us called to care for them. This passage goes a long way, I think, in dissipating the notion that the Old Testament is a book just of law and the New Testament a book of love. In Leviticus again we hear, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. It's a very loving instruction. As we move to the epistles, the first 2 weekends in October draw from Paul's letter to the Philippians. We heard the same letter twice last month. You know, it's a shame that often the lectionary bypasses or does not include verses that give great meaning to the selected text. That's why I think it's important, once we see the text presented by the lectionary, that we place it in its context, looking at the verses before it and afterward, its placement. On this first weekend in October, we read from the 3rd chapter, the 4th to the 14th verse. In this chapter, Paul is defending himself and describing his own faith as a Jew, a strict Pharisee, and a zealot for the law. He was defending for this Gentile population his own orthodoxy, but then states that he is now, quote, pressing on because Christ has made him his own. The earlier verses here speak about circumcision and those who are calling for the maintenance of this practice. And when I reflect on these verses, I often wonder what Paul's theological transition cost him. What does such a deepening do to us? And what do such choices cost us these days as members of our own congregations? The 4th chapter for the 2nd week in October is one of the most beautiful in all of Paul. Rejoice in the Lord always. Remember now, these are words of encouragement and love that are coming from the pen of a prisoner. There is also a line we may quickly pass over, but in this section, Paul requests help for 2 women, his loyal companions. And then he concludes this section with a series of instructions about the church's life together, calling for gentleness, calling for peace, prayer, and thanksgiving. In a sense, Paul brings to mind the wisdom and instruction from Leviticus. Now, the last 2 weekends in October, we turn our attention to the 1st and 2nd chapters of the letter to the Thessalonians, the first letter to the Thessalonians. In these chapters, Paul praises the church for their faith and for the example they have given their neighbors. He mentions not only the growth in the community, but is very honest about the hardships of persecution they face. This reality may draw us as preachers to the hardship that many Christian believers and others around the world find when they realize they are a minority in their homeland and often are victims of violence. They, Paul said, the Thessalonians, as believers, became models of hospitality and faith. And this letter to the Thessalonians is linked with Paul's letter to the Philippians because he writes about the hardships he faced in Philippi. He shares with the church the importance of gentleness, deep care, straightforwardness, and honesty in his ministry, wonderful words of wisdom for all of us. These letters offer us, called to service, to be a community of great wisdom. Now finally, in the Gospels, as we shared in our introduction, the 4 Gospels for October are from the Gospel of Matthew. The 4 weeks cover 2 parables, one on a vineyard and one on a wedding feast, and then a discussion about taxes and a discussion about the law. The links between the Hebrew Scriptures and the Gospel are very strong for the first week in October. The vineyard is a powerful metaphor in both. I believe it's wise to reflect on Matthew's community and what conflicts perhaps existed there as we study the parables for the first 2 weeks of this month. And you know, it's very easy to see how the early church applied these stories to their struggles and conflicts within their own communities. This first week gives us additional information about the growing conflict Jesus was facing. The wedding banquet parable follows the vineyard story, but I'm going to save that reflection for the sermon which will follow after this lecture. In Matthew 22, the Pharisees' opening remarks are interesting. They seem to be setting Jesus up with a question that they hope will bring him down. You are sincere, they say, and teach the way of God and show deference to no one. Then the test. And Jesus knows it. Is it lawful to pay taxes? Now, the taxing issue is a big one in our society, isn't it? Who pays, who does not, how much they pay, who benefits, and why there is such an economic disparity among us. But the fact that the questioner had a Roman coin is interesting, because on the coin was the image of Caesar. But to hold or handle anything that contained an image or an idol was forbidden. But they used that to try to trap him. The coin was also a symbol of oppression for the poor of Jesus' society. They wanted him to say, yes, it's lawful to pay taxes. And then if he said yes, he would have been misunderstood by those he served, those oppressed by Rome. If he said no, do not pay taxes, this would have given his opposition ammunition against him. He replies, do what is lawful. Give to each what they deserve. It's clear with whom Jesus' loyalty rests. Now this story's coming in the face of the destruction of the temple and war and conflict within Matthew's community. And then another test, another question comes at the end of the month. The question is, which commandment is the greatest? His answer is followed by a clever question on Jesus' part about the Messiah. And here we see the development of a process, the use of Hebrew Scriptures as an explanation in many cases of who Jesus was, a looking back, so to speak, to the sacred texts of the Jews. Well, you probably have thought of many, many themes that a preacher could use for the month of October. Let me share just a few. Vineyards, their beauty, and the images they create. For us in this part of New York State, these parables take hold just as they did in Jesus' day. You see, he used the ordinary. The inclusiveness of the banquet is another theme, a symbol and an ideal for us as Christians. Then these Gospels speak about the techniques used to test someone, to test in order to destroy. And that is a very contemporary issue we find in public life these days. The love of the law could be another theme seen in our Hebrew scriptures, in Paul and the gospel. A law of love that can get hidden very often in our attempts to proclaim what we believe to be orthodoxy. Another theme that strikes me is the cost of deep change within us. One could focus on Paul and the changes he gradually made in his life and the changes he wanted to share, and also the powerful influence of his original faith. You see, Christianity was born in the womb of Judaism. There's so much more we could say. I'm sure you've already thought about the text yourself. I invite you now to join us in the chapel, and I will share a sermon with you for the second Sunday in October. Thank you very much for listening.